Before 12 million viewers, the nation held its breath. A primetime debate meant to showcase leadership turned into a battlefield where words cut deeper than swords. J.D. Vance, calm but relentless, humiliated Jasmine Crockett over a simple law she should have known. A law that protected the jobs of countless American workers. Cameras captured the moment her confidence shattered, and millions witnessed what would be called the political disaster of the decade. Could a single misstep in front of a live audience truly end a career? As we take you through this dramatic, gripping account, remember, while this story is a work of fiction inspired by real public figures and issues, the emotions it explores are genuine. It's a reflection of what loyalty, truth, and integrity mean in the world of politics today. This narrative invites you not just to watch, but to question. How thin is the line between power and downfall? Stay with us, because what unfolds next might just change how you see power, truth, and downfall. It began as a quiet headline on a Tuesday morning, tucked beneath the larger noise of national politics. But within hours, that headline was everywhere. Prime-time debate announced J.D. Vance vs. Jasmine Crockett on protecting American jobs. The words echoed across television screens, lit up news tickers, and filled radio airwaves. The nation hadn't seen a debate like this in years, one that promised to pit two powerful, clashing visions of America against each other, live in front of millions. In steel towns scarred by shuttered factories and empty lots, the announcement felt personal. Workers leaned over coffee counters, the hum of machines in the background silenced for a moment as someone read the news aloud. Vance and Crockett, live, next Thursday. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken questions. Could this finally be a moment when their voices, forgotten by so many, might matter again? J.D. Vance, meanwhile, received the news in the quiet of his study. The room smelled faintly of old leather and paper, filled with law books worn at the edges from years of turning pages in search of answers. He closed his laptop, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. That afternoon, he drove to a steel town 2 hours away. No cameras, no staff, just J.D. and the people whose livelihoods had been lost to trade deals and broken promises. At the edge of a rusting mill, he spoke with a man who had worked the blast furnaces for 30 years. The man's hands were scarred, his voice rough from years of shouting over machines that no longer ran. "We're counting on you, J.D. Make them listen this time." J.D. nodded silently, the weight of that trust settling on his shoulders like steel itself. Later that night, he spread trade law documents across his desk, marking passages, studying loopholes, searching for the truth buried beneath the politics. He wasn't interested in clever sound bites. He wanted facts, because he knew, in that debate, one misstep could mean losing not just an argument, but the hope of thousands. Across the country, Jasmine Crockett's team celebrated the announcement with champagne and social media posts. Jasmine thrived in the spotlight. She appeared that night on a popular late-night show, her charisma radiating as she laughed and brushed off concerns about J.D. "Oh, J.D. Vance," she said with a grin that drew applause from the audience. "I respect the guy, but let's be honest. It's 2025, and he's still quoting laws from 1974. I'm not worried." Clips of her appearance went viral by morning. #CrockettStrong trended. Commentators praised her confidence. Behind the scenes, though, her advisors fretted that she hadn't yet reviewed the key trade policies that would surely come up. Jasmine waved them off. "I've got this. It's a debate, not law school." Meanwhile, the country held its breath. Streets filled with banners promoting the debate. Our jobs, our future, our debate. Televisions flickered in living rooms, barbershops and diners, replaying promos with dramatic music and split-screen shots of J.D. and Jasmine. Two faces, two futures. In factories where machines had long gone silent, workers gathered during breaks, their voices low, wondering aloud if this would be the night someone spoke for them at last. "You think Vance can take her on?" one man asked, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "I don't know," came the reply, "but I know I'm not missing it." Across social media, speculation soared. Would JD's quiet determination outshine Jasmine's star power? Would facts matter in a battle of personalities? And beneath it all, one unspoken electric question charged the air. What if everything changed that night? As the nation buzzed with anticipation over the coming debate, the camera of America's collective conscience turned, quietly but surely, toward the places long left behind. The headlines shouted of primetime glory and political spectacle. But in the corners of the country where industry had once thrived, there was only silence. The kind that comes when hope fades but memory lingers. The streets of steel towns, once loud with the rhythm of machines and the laughter of working families, now stood hollow. Storefronts boarded up with peeling paint. Main streets lined with empty buildings that had once been diners, hardware stores, barber shops, each window a reminder of what used to be. Weeds cracked the pavement where generations had walked, and rust crept along fences that used to guard bustling factories. In these forgotten places, the debate wasn't just another show. It was, perhaps, a final chance to matter again. J.D. Vance felt this as he drove through one of these towns, his car passing beneath faded signs that once proclaimed, "Made in America with pride." He parked outside a shuttered mill, its smokestacks now lifeless against the gray sky, and stepped onto ground that smelled faintly of oil and iron. Inside a nearby union hall, he met with retired steelworkers, men whose hands still bore the marks of their trade, whose eyes, once fierce with purpose, now carried the weight of lost dignity. They gathered around a battered table, mugs of cold coffee between them, as J.D. listened. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The men told their stories, of final shifts worked in the shadow of closure, of pensions slashed, of sons and daughters forced to leave town in search of work that no longer existed here. One man, his voice thick with emotion, gripped J.D.'s arm as he spoke. "You're not just fighting for jobs, son. You're fighting for who we are." That sentence stayed with J.D., carved into his mind like the etchings on a steel beam. He left the hall that night knowing the debate ahead wasn't about points scored on television. It was about faces like theirs, men and women who had built a nation, now wondering if the nation had forgotten them. Far from these quiet streets and shuttered mills, under chandeliers that sparkled like stars, and music that masked uneasy conversations, Jasmine Crockett walked through a lavish donor gala. The room glowed with polished silver, fine crystal, and promises whispered over glasses of champagne. Jasmine was in her element, charming, radiant, moving from table to table with practiced ease. She spoke of vision, of progress, of the bright future America could have if it followed her lead. Her donors smiled, nodded, raised their glasses higher. But beneath the sparkle and applause, her advisors exchanged worried looks. They knew what J.D. was doing. They knew he was walking those streets, hearing those voices. And they knew that no amount of media charm could substitute for preparation when the questions came. One aide leaned close to Jasmine, voice low. "We should review the trade policies tonight. He's going to come at you hard on that." Jasmine laughed softly, brushing a curl from her cheek. "Relax. People don't tune in for policy details. They want energy, vision. I'll win them with that." Outside, as Jasmine's motorcade pulled away into the night, the city lights blurred against the dark glass of her car window. The roar of applause from the gala faded behind her. But in steel towns hundreds of miles away, the echoes of empty factories, of broken promises, and of forgotten voices only grew louder. And as America prepared to watch two futures collide on stage, one could not help but wonder, when the lights of the debate burned bright, whose voices would truly be heard? And so, the night arrived. The night that had crept into every conversation, every news report, every quiet hope and lingering doubt across the country. The debate was no longer just a date on a calendar. It had become an event woven into the fabric of America's restless spirit. As the first notes of patriotic music swelled through television speakers, as red, white, and blue lights bathed the stage in solemn glow, millions of eyes turned toward that single screen where two futures were about to clash. Dramatic camera angles swept across the grand debate hall, pausing on the glint of polished wood floors, the sharp crease of flags hanging proudly behind the podiums, the faces of J.D. Vance and Jasmine Crockett as they stood, side by side yet worlds apart. JD, hands steady on the podium, his gaze calm but resolute, bore the quiet gravity of a man who knew what was at stake. Jasmine, radiant beneath the lights, smiled with the easy confidence of someone born for moments like this, moments where charm and presence seemed to matter most. Beyond the stage, in living rooms filled with the hum of anticipation, families gathered, their dinners forgotten on plates as all attention turned to the screen. In a small-town diner, veterans sat shoulder to shoulder at the counter, their coffee grown cold, their conversations silenced by the tension thick in the air. In union halls where photographs of strikes and victories long past hung on faded walls, workers clustered around TVs set atop old filing cabinets, their arms crossed, their faces etched with the wear of years, waiting, just waiting, to see who would speak for them tonight. In bars across the Rust Belt, where neon signs flickered and the scent of beer and wood smoke filled the air, men and women who had once drawn paychecks from mills and plants now long closed watched as if the outcome of this debate could somehow shape their tomorrows. The sense of shared uncertainty was almost tangible, as if the entire nation held its breath at once, suspended between what had been lost and what might yet be reclaimed. Then came the voice that signaled it had begun. The host, his tone steady, words measured, framing the night with the weight it deserved. Good evening, America. Tonight, two visions for our nation's future stand before you. Two leaders, two paths, one debate. Let's begin. The camera cut to JD, his expression unshaken, the lines of care and purpose clear on his face. Then to Jasmine, her smile unwavering, her eyes bright with the spark of competition. The lights dimmed over the audience, sharpening the focus on the stage, on the clash that was about to unfold. Across the country, the tension deepened. In the silence of that moment, that breath between introduction and argument, every viewer felt it, the possibility that history might be made tonight. And as the first question rose into the charged air, as the debate truly began, there was no mistaking the stakes. This wasn't just a battle of policies or personalities. It was a battle for the heart of a nation that had waited too long to be heard. The first question struck the air like a match in a dark room. What is your plan to protect American jobs in a rapidly changing global economy? For the briefest moment, the hall held its breath, waiting to see who would seize the moment first. It was Jasmine Crockett who leaned forward, voice clear, eyes blazing with energy, seizing the floor with a passion that filled the space. This isn't just about job, she declared, her tone rising with each word. This is about fairness, about inclusion, about making sure every American, no matter where they're from or what they look like, has a seat at the table in this economy. Her hands moved as she spoke, slicing the air to punctuate her points, drawing the audience into her rhythm. She spoke of opportunity, of lifting up communities left behind, not just by trade deals, but by systemic inequities. She painted a vision of an America where no one was invisible, where the future belonged to everyone. In homes and bars, in union halls and veterans clubs, the words landed like a spark. People nodded, some clapped, even from their couches, drawn in by the force of her delivery. On Twitter, the hashtags began to light up like fireworks. Hashtag Crockett Strong, hashtag Voice for All, hashtag Future for Everyone. Commentators on the networks nodded in approval, praising her for her energy, for her ability to connect emotionally right out of the gate. JD Vance listened without interruption, his hands steady on the podium, his gaze fixed on Jasmine as she spoke. When his turn came, his voice was quieter, measured, without the crescendos that had earned Jasmine her early applause. Every worker deserves dignity, JD began, his words deliberate, and the best way to protect that dignity is with policies that put American jobs first. Not slogans, not sound bites, but action rooted in the law and in reality. He spoke of the need for clear trade protections, of how decades of bad deals had gutted industries and hollowed out towns. His words carried weight, but in the glow of Jasmine's fiery opening, they seemed, to some, like a dimmer light. The commentators jumped in quickly, their voices filling the airwaves even before JD had fully finished. Vance's points are solid, but where's the passion? One said. Crockett is commanding the stage tonight, another chimed in. She's the one connecting with people emotionally. On social media, the tide seemed to surge further in Jasmine's favor. Clips of her opening remarks were already circulating, spliced with inspiring music, shared thousands of times within minutes. Yet in the midst of this swelling praise, there was something almost imperceptible that began to stir. In the quiet spaces, the union halls, the steel town diners, the living rooms where workers watched with arms crossed and hearts guarded, JD's steady words lingered. They didn't electrify the room, but they planted questions. Was passion enough? Were promises enough? Or in the end, would substance speak louder than fire? As the debate moved forward, the contrast was clear. Jasmine's energy had ignited the night. JD's calm had steadied it. And while the cameras zoomed in on Jasmine's commanding presence, the real question that hovered, unspoken but deeply felt, was this. Who would win the hearts not just of the moment, but of the long, hard fight ahead? Jasmine wasn't finished. Sensing that her fiery opening had won the room, and perhaps the nation, she leaned in, ready to press her advantage. The next question from the moderator barely had time to settle in the air before she seized it, her voice rising with conviction. Let's be honest here, she said, eyes flicking toward JD, her tone sharp but laced with charm. My opponent keeps talking about trade deals like we're stuck in the 1970s. The world has changed. America has changed. What we need now is leadership that looks forward, not leadership that clings to the past. Her words landed like quick jabs, not hard enough to end the fight, but enough to keep JD on the defensive. Before he could fully respond, she interrupted again, smoothly, skillfully, turning his points into openings for her own narrative. When JD spoke of small towns hollowed out by unfair trade, of jobs lost to policies that put foreign profits above American families, Jasmine was ready with counters that sparkled for the cameras. We can't build the future by crying over the past, she said, the line crafted perfectly for sound bites. We have to move forward, together. The commentators ate it up. Crockett's energy is undeniable tonight, one analyst said, as clips of her lines began to flood social media. She's quick, she's sharp, and she's framing Vance as out of step. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag forward with Crockett. Hashtag JD out of touch. Hashtag new vision now. On television screens, Jasmine seemed to shine brighter with each exchange. Her confidence building as she painted JD as a man too focused on what was lost to see what could be gained. JD stayed steady, but it was clear the rhythm of the debate was slipping from his grasp. His arguments about the devastation of entire industries under poorly written trade agreements, about communities left behind, about workers who had given their lives to factories that no longer stood. All of it risked being buried beneath the swell of Jasmine's rhetoric. His voice was firm, his points sound, but in a battle of noise and passion, they struggled to break through. Yet beyond the lights and the hashtags, beyond the applause in the hall and the trending clips online, the viewers at home were not so easily swayed. In some homes, in cities and suburbs, among those who believed deeply in the power of vision and new ideas, Jasmine's fire resonated. They admired her spirit, her refusal to let JD define the terms of the debate. She's what we need, some said, raising their glasses to the screen. Someone who speaks to tomorrow. But elsewhere, in union halls, in quiet kitchens of steel towns, in the living rooms of families who had watched the factories close and the jobs vanish, there was a different reaction. They watched Jasmine's interruptions, her polished lines, her unflinching confidence, and felt something missing. Beneath the flash, they sensed the hollow space where answers should be. And as JD's words about loyalty, about forgotten workers, about dignity drifted through the noise, they clung to them, even as the world seemed to cheer for something louder. The debate moved forward, the tension tightening. Jasmine had thrown the opening blows, and now she kept JD under fire, determined to keep him there. But the fight was far from over. And in the hearts of many watching, the question lingered. Would passion carry the night, or would truth find its voice before the end? But as the rapid fire of Jasmine's words filled the room, and her momentum seemed unstoppable, something began to shift, so slight, so quiet, that at first it escaped notice. JD, standing firm at his podium, let the storm of interruptions pass, waiting for the moment when substance could break through noise. And when it came, he took it, not with force, not with volume, but with the weight of something that could not be brushed aside. I respect my opponent's passion, JD began, his voice steady, even cutting through the swirl of sound bites and applause. But passion doesn't protect jobs. Policy does. And when we talk about policy, we have to talk about the facts, including the steel tariffs and trade protections that were abandoned, because some thought they didn't fit the image of progress. His words landed softer than Jasmine's jabs, but sharper. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rush. Instead, he spoke of a specific clause in a trade agreement, one that had once shielded American steel from unfair foreign dumping, a clause Jasmine had, at a pivotal moment, publicly supported removing in the name of freer markets. The details weren't flashy, but they were real. JD reminded the audience, and Jasmine, that it was that very removal that opened the floodgates for cheap steel imports, driving mills into closure and workers into unemployment. For the briefest second, the camera caught it. The flicker in Jasmine's eyes, the tightness at the corners of her mouth, the split second of uncertainty that betrayed a crack in her confident armor. It was so quick that most viewers missed it, their attention still fixed on her polished poise and practiced smile. But in that moment, for those watching closely, the dynamic on stage shifted. JD, sensing the opening, did not gloat. He didn't smirk, didn't jab. He simply kept going, his words gaining quiet strength. We can talk about inclusion, we can talk about opportunity, but if we don't protect the industries that give working families a chance to succeed, those words are just promises that never touch the ground. In the hall, the applause that had flowed so easily for Jasmine slowed, replaced by a stillness as people listened, truly listened, to the substance behind JD's measured tone. Even the commentators hesitated, their earlier excitement dampened by the weight of specifics, by the unexpected solidity of JD's stance. On social media, the immediate flood of praise for Jasmine found itself met with new voices, quieter but rising. Wait, what's this about the clause? Is he right about that deal? We lost our plan after that change. The segment drew to a close, and as the cameras zoomed out, what had felt like a runaway win for Jasmine no longer seemed so certain. She still stood tall, still smiled, still commanded the stage with charisma. But JD, in his quiet way, had planted something, a seed of doubt, a reminder that beneath the flash of debate, the truth waits, patient, steady, and impossible to ignore forever. As the moderator thanked both candidates and called for a short break, the tension in the room didn't ease. It shifted. The battle ahead would be different now. The subtle shift had begun, and with it, the first hint that this night might not belong to the loudest voice after all. The break ended, and as the cameras returned, the stage seemed somehow different. The energy that had surged around Jasmine's early performance now mingled with a quiet tension, the kind that fills a room when the first cracks appear in a polished surface. JD stood steady, his fingers lightly resting on the edge of his podium, eyes focused, mind clear. The moderator's voice cut through the hush, inviting the next question. And JD seized the moment. Before we move forward, JD began, his tone respectful but firm, I think it's important that we ground this conversation in the law that has shaped so much of what's happened to American steel. Congresswoman Crockett, could you please cite for the audience the specific clause of the 1974 Trade Act that provides protection against unfair steel imports? The question landed with precision, as if a single thread had been pulled from a tightly woven fabric. For a heartbeat, Jasmine's smile remained, confident, unshaken. But then, as the weight of the request settled, her expression changed. Subtly at first, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a breath caught just slightly too long. The room seemed to lean forward as one, waiting for her answer. Of course, Jasmine said, her voice still warm, but edged now with an urgency she hadn't shown before. The clause addressing unfair trade practices is Section 202, which, as we know, provides the remedies necessary to protect our industries from harm. JD didn't interrupt. He let the silence after her words hang, let the weight of what she had said, and what she hadn't, fill the space between them. Somewhere in the hall, a cough echoed sharply, breaking the stillness. Across living rooms, bars, and union halls, viewers leaned in closer, sensing that something had shifted yet again. JD's voice, when it came, was stronger now, not louder but more certain. Actually, Congresswoman, Section 202 addresses relief from import surges, but the specific protection for American steel. The clause that allows the president to act against unfair practices by foreign producers is Section 301. Section 301, which you once advocated modifying to ease market restrictions, is the backbone of trade enforcement for our industries. There was no malice in his words, no mockery, only fact. Only the quiet authority of someone who knew not just what he was talking about, but why it mattered. The cameras caught Jasmine's face, the tightening of her jaw, the blink that came just a second too late to seem natural. The crack widened. The confidence that had carried her through the first half of the night seemed to falter, just enough for people to notice. Commentators on air paused, recalibrating. That was a sharp move by Vance, one said, the enthusiasm of earlier replaced by a tone of grudging respect. He's reminding the audience this isn't just about style, it's about substance. On social media, a new wave of posts began. Vance schooling on trade law. Crockett fumbles the clause. Section 301. Remember that, JD continued, his voice gathering force not through volume, but through clarity. This isn't about winning a moment on stage, he said. It's about understanding the tools we have to protect American workers and using them. The hall grew quieter still. Even Jasmine's supporters in the audience sat back, their applause stilled, their attention fixed. The legal trap had been set, and without even realizing it, Jasmine had stepped right into it. And as the segment neared its end, JD stood stronger than before, not because he had shouted louder, but because he had shown what so many watching had longed to see: command of the facts and the courage to speak them. The air in the debate hall seemed heavier now, the earlier hum of excitement replaced by a hush filled with uncertainty. JD's calm, precise correction of the trade law clause had done more than expose a gap in Jasmine's knowledge. It had changed the energy of the night. The shift was subtle at first, like the faint tremor before a storm, but it spread, felt by those both in the room and watching from afar. In union halls where workers had gathered around battered TVs, men and women exchanged glances, silent but telling. A steel worker, arms crossed over a faded company jacket, raised an eyebrow toward his friend, as if asking without words, did she really not know that? In a small-town bar where the floorboards creaked with every step and old signs for domestic beer lined the walls, conversations paused mid-sentence as heads tilted toward the screen. The earlier cheers for Jasmine's fiery style softened, replaced by furrowed brows and thoughtful frowns. Even the commentators on air, who had moments earlier praised Jasmine's command of the stage, hesitated now. The camera panned to the panel as they looked at each other, seeking confirmation before speaking. One finally broke the silence. Vance just took control of the conversation, he said, his voice measured. That wasn't just a fact check. That was a reminder of what's at stake. Another analyst nodded slowly. It's the first time tonight Crockett looked off balance. Vance hit a nerve. And on social media, where the speed of reaction was as fast as thought itself, the tone began to shift. Posts that had celebrated Jasmine's energy and wit started to blend with a new wave of questions. Wait, is she bluffing on the trade law? Did she really get the clause wrong? Vance just schooled her. This is getting interesting. The hashtags that had once belonged to Jasmine's supporters were now joined by tags like hashtag Section 301 and hashtag Vance knows the law, and they gained traction with each passing minute. JD didn't gloat. He didn't glance toward the crowd for approval or raise his voice to capitalize on the moment. Instead, he drew the focus back where it belonged. Not on the candidates, but on the people they claimed to represent. His voice softened, but the weight of his words grew heavier. This isn't about winning a debate, he said, his gaze steady on the camera, as if speaking directly to those watching from their living rooms and union halls. It's about the families who've watched factories close because of policies that failed to protect them. It's about communities that have lost not just jobs, but the dignity that comes with honest work. Section 301 isn't just a number in a law book. It's a promise we made to those families, and it's a promise we failed to keep. The camera lingered on JD's face as he spoke, the lights of the stage reflecting in his eyes, but it also cut away to Jasmine, still smiling but less certain, to the audience members leaning forward, listening more intently than before. The atmosphere had changed. The contest of personalities was giving way to something deeper, something that touched the core of why so many had tuned in at all. As the segment edged toward its close, the tension didn't dissipate. It shifted, settling into a new form. The night was no longer about who could speak louder or with more flair. It was about who could speak with truth. And for the first time, many watching at home began to wonder, had JD found the key to winning not just the stage, but their trust? The weight of JD's steady voice, the clarity of his words, and the unexpected turn in the debate left Jasmine standing at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. The confidence that had carried her through the first half of the night began to feel heavy, no longer the bright armor it had seemed when the lights first came up. And in that moment, as the silence of the hall pressed in around her, she did what many do when the ground beneath them starts to shift. She tried to pivot. "Look," Jasmine said, her voice quickening, her hands gesturing more than before, as if motion could fill the space that words now struggled to occupy. "We can stand here and recite sections of decades-old trade laws, but the fact is, America needs solutions that look forward, not backward." She tried to recapture her earlier rhythm, to regain the spark that had so electrified the room at the start. But the pivot felt forced. The cadence wasn't quite right. And for the first time that night, the applause came slower, more tentative, as if even her most loyal supporters were trying to process what had just happened. She pressed on, but in doing so, the cracks widened. In an effort to reclaim the narrative, Jasmine dove deeper into policy, but the details betrayed her. She spoke of tariff relief measures that didn't apply to steel. She referenced a section of agricultural trade law, intending to bolster her point, but instead drawing confused glances from the moderators and commentators alike. The tangle of numbers, clauses, and terminology began to blur, and with every misstep, the clear image she had painted earlier in the night grew fuzzier. JD watched without interruption. There was no smirk, no satisfaction in his eyes. His face remained calm, respectful, focused on the task at hand. He let the facts and Jasmine's missteps speak for themselves. And in doing so, he gained something far more valuable than a single point scored in a debate. He gained moral ground. His quiet command of the law, his refusal to gloat or grandstand, began to cast him in a different light, not just as a debater, but as a leader. In homes across the country, the shift was felt. The same viewers who had cheered Jasmine's fire now found themselves uneasy. The same commentators who had praised her command of the stage now hesitated, their voices laced with caution as they analyzed the unraveling in real time. "She's losing her footing," one said softly, as if reluctant to speak the truth aloud. "This is turning." On social media, the mood continued to evolve. Posts that had cheered her energy earlier in the evening began to question the depth behind it. What's she saying now? Did she just mix up steel and agriculture? Vance is staying steady. This is impressive. The tide, which had so strongly flowed in Jasmine's favor, now began to ebb, leaving behind questions that hadn't been asked at the start of the night. As the segment drew to a close, the applause that had once come easily felt thinner, more strained. The hall, once filled with energy and noise, now seemed to hold its breath. The nation, too, paused, reconsidering what it had believed just an hour before was certain. The confident image of Jasmine Crockett, so radiant at the debate's opening, now stood shadowed by doubt. And J.D. Vance, once painted as the quieter voice on stage, now emerged as the steady hand in a storm that was only just beginning. The air in the hall was already charged, thick with the weight of Jasmine's unraveling and J.D.'s growing command. But what came next would shift the night from a contest of words to a moment that would be replayed analyzed, and remembered far beyond the debate stage. JD, still calm, still measured, placed his hand lightly on the microphone, his voice steady as he addressed the moderator. Before we move to the next topic, I'd like to share a document relevant to this discussion on trade protections, if I may. The moderator, sensing the gravity in JD's tone, nodded. Proceed, Senator. JD glanced briefly toward Jasmine, not with malice, not with triumph, but with the quiet determination of someone who believed the truth deserved to be seen. He gestured toward the screens positioned around the hall. This is an internal email from Congresswoman Crockett's office, dated 8 months ago. In it, she advises members of her caucus to support amendments to weaken key protections for U.S. steel under existing trade law. As JD spoke, the giant screens flickered, then filled with the image of the email. Jasmine's name, the date, the subject line, trade modernization, recommendations for caucus vote. The body of the email, highlighted lines and all, was clear. I recommend supporting these changes to reduce barriers and encourage open markets, even in sectors like steel, where protectionism no longer aligns with a forward-looking trade policy. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The kind of silence that fills a space when something undeniable is laid bare. Then came the collective sound that no candidate wants to hear. The audible gasp of an audience witnessing not just a misstep, but a revelation. The cameraman, as if drawn by instinct, zoomed in on Jasmine's face. The lights, once so flattering, now seemed too bright, casting every flicker of emotion into sharp relief. Her eyes widened, just slightly. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The confident veneer cracked, not with a dramatic collapse, but with the subtle, devastating fracture of truth meeting daylight. JD said nothing more at first. He let the image speak. Let the audience, the viewers at home, the nation absorb what they were seeing. Across living rooms, bars, union halls, fingers paused over remote controls. Social media feeds exploded. Screenshots of the email flooded timelines. Is this real? She pushed to weaken steel protections? Hashtag Crockett exposed began trending within minutes, overtaking the hashtags that had once cheered her early performance. Even commentators, so quick with their takes earlier in the night, were stunned into momentary silence. When they did speak, it was with caution, as if the weight of what had just unfolded demanded a different kind of response. This changes the debate, one finally said. It's no longer about style or sound bites. Vance has just shifted the ground beneath Crockett's feet. Jasmine tried to recover, but the moment had settled. She cleared her throat, managed a faint smile, and spoke, though her voice lacked the ease it once held. Trade policy is complex, she said, reaching for composure. And what I've always advocated is a balanced approach, one that considers both our industries and our global partnerships. But the words felt thin now, unable to bridge the gulf that had opened between her image and the reality displayed in black and white behind her. JD, for his part, remained steady. The issue isn't complexity, he said quietly. It's loyalty. Loyalty to the workers who built this country, who rely on us not to trade away their future for promises that never seem to come true. And in that instant, as the camera panned across the audience, faces sober, focused, changed, it became clear. The night belonged no longer to the loudest voice, but to the one that had spoken truth when it mattered most. The debate hall was still reverberating from the shock of JD's revelation when the ripple effect began to spread beyond its walls. What had started as a crack in Jasmine's confident image now thundered across the country, carried by every screen, every device, every voice that had tuned in, hoping to witness history, and now realized they had. Within minutes of the email flashing on the giant screens, the digital world erupted. The hashtag Jasmine sold us out shot to the top of trending lists, not just on Twitter, but across every major platform. At first, it was disbelief. Screenshots of the email filled timelines with captions like, "Is this real?" and "Tell me this is doctored." But as viewers replayed the clip, as JD's steady voice echoed again through highlight reels, As Jasmine's frozen expression was shared and reshared, the disbelief hardened into anger. Workers in steel towns posted videos, raw and unedited, their voices trembling not with surprise but with the deep, familiar sting of betrayal. One man stood in front of the closed gates of a steel mill, his hard hat in hand, eyes burning with unshed tears. "We trusted you," he said into his phone's camera. "We trusted you to fight for us, and you sold us out." The clip, that single devastating moment where the email was revealed, where Jasmine faltered, where JD stood firm, flooded YouTube Shorts and TikTok. Some were posted by political commentators, others by ordinary citizens who had recorded the debate on their phones, unable to believe what they were seeing. The views climbed by the minute, 1 million, then 2, then 5. By dawn, the moment had been seen by tens of millions. Reaction videos multiplied, people gasping at their screens, pointing at the email, shaking their heads in disbelief. News networks scrambled to keep up. Anchors interrupted regular programming with breaking news banners. Debate coverage that had been planned as routine political analysis turned into emergency panels dissecting the fallout. On one channel, a veteran political correspondent said what many were thinking, but few had yet voiced aloud. "This isn't just a bad debate moment. This could end a career." And through it all, JD said little. Clips of him in that moment, quiet, respectful, focused on facts, reinforced the growing narrative. Here was a man who hadn't just won a point, but had stood for something. Commentators replayed his words. "It's about loyalty." And in barbershops, diners, union halls, living rooms, those words stuck. Jasmine's team rushed to respond, but their statements felt hollow, drowned out by the wave that had already crashed over them. The story wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to the nation now, and the nation had made up its mind, or at least had begun to. The firestorm wasn't slowing. It was only gaining strength. The firestorm outside the hall was already raging, but inside the tension grew so thick it seemed to pull at the very air. Jasmine stood at her podium, the glow of the stage lights now uncomfortably hot, the silence of the room deafening. The screen behind her still faintly displayed the now infamous email, a reminder she could not escape. The confidence that had once carried her through fiery openings and sharp retorts had slipped through her fingers, leaving only the weight of the moment and the eyes of a nation upon her. She cleared her throat, grasping for steadiness. Let's be clear about what's happening here," she began, but her voice trembled at the edges, the assured cadence gone. Her words came faster, as if racing ahead might somehow outrun the damage. "Trade law is complex. It evolves. My record reflects a commitment to modernization, to balancing domestic interests with our global responsibilities." She paused, searching the room, hoping for the nod of an ally, the smile of reassurance from the crowd. But the faces staring back were impassive, waiting not for excuses, but for clarity, for something she could no longer seem to give. She tried again. And it's unfair to reduce years of nuanced policy work to a single email, taken out of context during a heated political climate? Her voice cracked, just slightly but enough. Enough for the camera to catch it, enough for the room to feel it. The words that followed were a blur. Mentions of global supply chains, of partnership with allies, of the need for agility in trade agreements. But they came jumbled, incoherent, a flurry of talking points that no longer connected. The more she spoke, the deeper the hole became, every sentence another stone weighing down what remained of her argument. JD stood silent at first, watching with a mixture of focus and quiet resolve. He didn't interrupt, didn't roll his eyes or shake his head. When the moderator turned to him for a response, JD's voice was low, steady, and, in its simplicity, devastating. "This isn't about me," he said, his words slicing cleanly through the fog that had settled over the room. "It's about the American worker. It's about the men and women who built this country with their hands and deserve better than to be bartered away in backroom deals." The effect was immediate. Where Jasmine's words had tangled, JD's landed like hammer blows. Not loud, not angry, but firm, unyielding, undeniable. The hall, once so charged with energy, felt subdued now, as if everyone knew they had witnessed the turning point. The moment when a contest of ideas became something else entirely, a reckoning. The moderator glanced from JD to Jasmine, then back again, his own unease visible as he adjusted his papers. The tension in the room had reached its breaking point. What had begun as a spirited exchange of visions had become something raw, something that felt almost too personal for public display. After a brief pause, his voice carried the authority of finality. Given the time and the intensity of this evening's discussion, we're going to conclude the debate here. I want to thank both of our participants for their time tonight. The closing words hung awkwardly in the air. No applause followed, no rush of energy as the cameras began their slow pan across the stage. Instead, there was only the quiet murmur of a crowd unsure of what to do with what they had just witnessed. And in homes, bars, union halls, everywhere this debate had been watched, people sat back, silent, processing, understanding that they had seen more than just a political debate. They had seen a collapse, live and undeniable, in the quiet rise of a voice they hadn't expected to carry the night. The cameras faded to black, the debate stage emptying into silence. But across America, the storm had only just begun. Within minutes of the moderator's closing words, the first headlines blazed across news sites, their fonts large and unforgiving. Disaster on live TV, Crockett stumbles in crucial debate. Jasmine Crockett's trade betrayal stuns nation. Steel workers react with fury after debate bombshell. Cable networks cut away from scheduled programming, their banners flashing breaking news as panels of pundits assembled hastily to dissect the collapse the nation had just witnessed. On screen after screen, the now infamous moment replayed. The flicker of hesitation in Jasmine's eyes, the fumbling of her words, the giant email on display for all to see. JD's steady, unflinching statement, "This isn't about me, it's about the American worker." The sound bites looped endlessly, each replay driving the moment deeper into the public's consciousness. Clips were slowed down, freeze-framed, analyzed from every angle, as if by examining it closely enough, someone might find an explanation for how it all had gone so wrong. Pundits across the political spectrum weighed in, many of them struggling to hide their astonishment. On one channel, a seasoned commentator who had covered debates for 3 decades shook his head in disbelief. "I've seen bad nights before," he said, his voice low. "But this was a meltdown. And the worst part is, it wasn't just style, it was substance. She didn't know the law, and Vance exposed that in front of the entire nation." On another network, a political strategist who had once advised Jasmine appeared visibly rattled. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be untouchable tonight. But the email, the law, the failure to pivot, it all came together in the worst way possible. Radio shows lit up as workers called in, their voices raw with anger, heartbreak, and a sense of betrayal that no talking point could mend. From Pittsburgh to Gary, from Bethlehem to Detroit, they spoke with the kind of unvarnished truth that comes only from lived experience. A steelworker in Ohio, his voice thick with emotion, told a local host, "She stood up there and smiled at us, and the whole time, she'd already given us away." That email wasn't policy. That was a knife in the back. Another caller, a retired mill foreman, said simply, "We trusted her. We thought maybe this time someone was listening. We were wrong." On social media, the firestorm continued without pause. The hashtag Jasmine sold us out dominated trending lists, joined now by others. Hashtag trade trader, hashtag steel betrayal, hashtag Vance was right. Reaction videos filled feeds, ordinary citizens recording themselves in the moments after the debate, shaking their heads, pointing at the screen, asking the question that now echoed everywhere. How could she not know? But even as the fury raged, the focus began to shift. Amid the anger, JD's name rose steadily in prominence, his performance praised not for theatrics, but for its clarity and control. Clips of his closing words, simple, direct, and unwavering, circulated alongside the images of Jasmine's faltering. "This isn't about me, it's about the American worker." The phrase became a rallying cry, a meme, a slogan, as people reposted it with messages of support, of hope, of renewed belief that maybe, just maybe, someone still spoke for them, And as the night wore on, it became clear that what had happened on that stage was no longer just a debate. It was a reckoning, one that no headline, no spin, no prepared statement could undo. As the media frenzy intensified and the voices of betrayal echoed across airwaves and social feeds, the official machinery of Washington began to stir. What started as headlines and commentary soon demanded action, and within 24 hours of the debate's disastrous conclusion, the Congressional Ethics Committee announced it was opening a formal inquiry into Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's ties to foreign corporate donors. The press release was terse but devastating. The committee has received credible concerns regarding the alignment of Representative Crockett's advocacy with foreign corporate interests at potential odds with the welfare of American workers. An investigation is underway. The announcement sent another shockwave through a political establishment already reeling. News anchors, barely catching their breath from the night before, broke into programming once again. Pundits spoke in hushed tones of the rarity and seriousness of such an inquiry. "This isn't just damage control now," one analyst said on a major network. "This is a formal reckoning, the kind that can end careers." The image of Jasmine's email, paired side by side with the Ethics Committee's statement, dominated screens. Graphics flashed timelines of her donations, lists of the corporations tied to the amendments she had supported, and sound bites from the debate that now seemed to carry even more weight. Inside her party, once friendly faces grew distant. Party leaders who had just days before praised Jasmine's vision now chose their words carefully or chose silence altogether. A prominent senator, previously a staunch ally, issued a carefully worded statement expressing confidence in the process, but stopping short of offering support. Endorsements that had once filled her campaign website disappeared quietly overnight. The political winds had shifted, and Jasmine could feel their chill. In the quiet of her Capitol office, Jasmine sat alone, the grandeur of the space doing nothing to ease the weight pressing on her chest. The television on the wall played the debate clip on a loop, not because she wanted to see it, but because every channel carried it. She watched herself stumble through the explanation, watched JD's steady gaze, heard again his words that now seemed etched into the nation's memory. "This isn't about me, it's about the American worker." Outside her window, the chants began. At first faint, just a handful of voices. But as the day wore on, they grew, rising in volume and conviction. "Resign, Jasmine, resign! We need leaders, not traitors." The words echoed up from the street below, relentless, unforgiving. She drew the blinds, but the sound seeped through, a reminder that the storm outside was not just political, it was personal. She turned from the window, sank into her chair, and let the weight of it all settle. The office, once a place of ambition and purpose, now felt like a cell. The framed photos on her shelves, smiling constituents, proud moments on the House floor, seemed to mock her. The phone on her desk remained silent. The calls that once poured in with praise and opportunity now replaced by avoidance and distance. Across town, J.D. Vance gave no victory speeches. There were no triumphant declarations, no gloating interviews. He returned to his work, his statements focused on policy, on rebuilding trust, on putting forward proposals to strengthen protections for American industries. But the contrast was stark, and it did not go unnoticed. Where Jasmine had fallen, J.D. appeared to rise, not because he sought the spotlight, but because, at that moment, he embodied the steadiness so many were desperate to see. And as the day drew to a close, the question no longer seemed to be whether Jasmine could recover, but how long it would take for the last of her allies to step away, and when the final curtain would fall. While the corridors of power grew colder for Jasmine Crockett, and the chants outside her window refused to fade, J.D. Vance stepped quietly into a different kind of spotlight. There were no grand announcements, no carefully orchestrated press tours. Instead, J.D. did what he had always done in the days following the debate. He went to the places where the cameras rarely lingered, where the applause came not from pundits, but from the people who had been waiting far too long to hear someone speak for them. In small town halls with peeling paint and creaking floors, J.D. stood before packed rooms of steel workers, machinists, welders, and truck drivers. The faces before him bore the marks of long days and hard years. Men and women who had weathered the storms of layoffs, factory closures, and forgotten promises. And to them, JD spoke not of victory, but of loyalty. It's not about debates, he told them, his voice firm but humble. It's about remembering who built this country and standing by them, even when it isn't easy, especially when it isn't easy. At a reopened factory on the outskirts of a Rust Belt city, he walked the floor alongside workers as they described the pride of seeing the machines roar back to life. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words landed with quiet force. Every job here represents a family that's a little more secure tonight. That's what we fight for. That's what we protect. The workers responded not with polite applause, but with standing ovations that came from the heart. The kind of applause that meant we see you, we believe you, we trust you. News crews followed at a distance, capturing scenes that played starkly against the images of Jasmine's office blinds drawn tight, her isolation deepening. Where Jasmine's collapse had been broadcast in endless loops of missteps and defensive words, JD's sincerity became the news story. Headlines shifted. Vance becomes voice of forgotten workers. From debate stage to factory floor, JD's quiet rise. Pundits who had once doubted his appeal now marveled at how effortlessly he connected with the very people politicians so often claimed to represent. In each appearance, JD refused to gloat. When asked about the debate, he simply shook his head. This was never about scoring points. It's about getting it right. For them. He gestured toward the crowd, the workers, the families who filled the halls, the ones who had stayed behind after the cameras left. His focus stayed on the future, on proposals for stronger trade protections, on plans to rebuild industries, on laws that would back the words he spoke with action. And across the country, people noticed. Those who had watched the debate with growing disillusionment now watched JD with cautious hope. In homes where factories had closed, in towns where main streets had gone dark, his message struck a chord that had long been silent. His sincerity, his steadiness, his refusal to play to the spectacle, all of it stood in stark contrast to the collapse they had witnessed in Jasmine. Where she had seemed to lose herself in the noise, JD's voice cut through, steady and clear. The nation, still grappling with the fallout of the debate, began to shift its gaze, not to the loudest voice, nor to the brightest stage lights, but to the man who had stayed true when it mattered most. And as JD left another town hall, shaking hands, listening to stories, promising not solutions in sound bites but in substance, one thing became clear. This was his moment, and he was making it count. The ripple effects of the debate's fallout soon grew into a tidal wave that swept through Jasmine Crockett's district. What had begun as murmurs of discontent on radio shows and social media now erupted into the streets. By the end of the week, crowds gathered outside her district office, their voices unified in chants that echoed down the avenues she once walked as a celebrated representative. Hand-painted signs rose above the sea of faces. She sold us out. Resign now. We deserve better. The anger that had simmered quietly in living rooms and union halls now spilled into the open, impossible to ignore. What made it harder still was the makeup of the crowds. These weren't the faces of perennial protest. These were factory workers who had once attended Jasmine's campaign rallies, veterans who had proudly voted for her, small business owners who had hosted her fundraisers. Former supporters who had once cheered her promises now carried placards calling for her resignation. Reporters descended on the protests, capturing raw voices, unfiltered grief, and betrayal that ran deep. A retired steelworker, his cap pulled low over weary eyes, spoke into a microphone. We believed her. She looked us in the eye and told us she'd fight for us. And now we find out she was helping the people who took our jobs? That's not just politics. That's betrayal. The scenes played out across every major network. Drone footage captured the scale of the marches, weaving through streets, stopping at the district office where windows remained shuttered, blinds drawn tight as if to block out the storm. Commentators described the moment not as a mere political backlash, but as an uprising of the disillusioned, the forgotten, the ones who had placed their faith in promises now broken. Perhaps most haunting of all was the silent protest staged by the factories themselves. In an act of quiet defiance and mourning, several plants, or what remained of them, flew American flags at half-mast. The tattered banners flapped in the cold wind above empty parking lots and silent assembly lines, stark symbols of industries lost and trust betrayed. News cameras captured the images, framing them against gray skies, the commentary almost unnecessary. The symbolism spoke for itself. Jasmine watched it all unfold from the isolation of her office. The chants outside louder now, relentless. She could see the crowds from between the slats of the blinds, but dared not step out. Each chant, each sign, each flag at half-mast was a reminder that the fall from grace was not just political, it was personal. And in those streets, in those factories, in the voices of the people she once vowed to serve, the word that echoed louder than any other was clear: betrayal. As the chants of protest filled the streets of Jasmine's district and the images of flags at half-mast looped across television screens, J.D. Vance quietly set out on a tour that would take him deep into the heart of the Rust Belt. There were no fanfares, no victory banners, no bombast. Yet in city after city, town after town, he was greeted by packed halls and standing room-only crowds, people drawn not by spectacle, but by a hunger for something steady, something true. In Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Gary, places long marked by the scars of lost industry, J.D. stood before workers, small business owners, veterans, and families who had felt invisible for far too long. His speeches were not fiery tirades or triumphant boasts. Instead, they were filled with quiet conviction, each word chosen with care. America works when Americans are put first, he told them, his voice carrying not just through microphones, but into the hearts of those who listened. It's not about left or right, it's about loyalty. It's about rebuilding what was lost and making sure it's never taken from us again. The crowds responded not with the wild cheers of a rally, but with the deep, sustained applause of people who had found, at last, a voice that spoke to their struggles without exploiting them. Workers wiped at their eyes as J.D. spoke of dignity and fairness, of laws that would mean something, of jobs that wouldn't vanish with the next bad deal. Veterans stood straighter, small business owners nodded, and in every room he entered, the sense of unity grew stronger. What made J.D.'s rise all the more remarkable was what he chose not to do. There was no gloating, no mention of Jasmine by name. When reporters pressed him to comment on her downfall, he simply shook his head. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," he said. "It's about lifting up the people who have been left behind for too long." He focused not on the collapse of a rival, but on solutions: stronger trade protections, fairer tax policies, investments in American industry. And with each speech, each handshake, each promise made and meant, J.D.'s star rose, not in the glare of headlines, but in the quiet conviction of those who now saw him as something rare, a leader who had earned their trust. The sound came first, sharp, clear, cutting through the cold morning air like a promise kept. A factory whistle, silent for nearly a decade, blew again as the steel plant's gates swung open. J.D. Vance stood just beyond them, watching as workers, some with tears in their eyes, crossed the threshold they had feared they'd never see again. The machinery, dormant for so long, rumbled back to life, filling the air with the hum of resilience, of work, of purpose restored. The smell of oil, hot steel, and industry returned, mingling with the crisp breeze, familiar and welcome. J.D. didn't seek the cameras that had gathered at a distance. He didn't wave to the reporters or call for attention. Instead, he moved quietly along the factory floor, shaking the calloused hands of the men and women who had waited too long for this moment. Their faces, lined by years of uncertainty, now showed cautious pride. And as he met their eyes, J.D. spoke only the words that mattered. "This is what we're fighting for." The moment wasn't about politics. It wasn't about headlines. It was about dignity reborn in the clang of steel against steel, in the hiss of furnaces warming once again, in the rhythm of work that gave communities reason to hope. Outside, families gathered to watch. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, pointing to the stacks where steam once more met sky. Flags that had hung limp for years caught the wind again, snapping high above the plant as if to salute the workers below. News crews captured it all, Not staged or polished, but real. And across the country, as the images spread, a sense of renewal began to take root. For the first time in years, it seemed, the nation could see proof that resilience wasn't just a word spoken on stages. It was a sound, a sight, a promise fulfilled, and the beginning of something stronger. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the Capitol as Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium for what everyone already knew would be her final address as a sitting member of Congress. The room was packed with reporters, the clicking of cameras a relentless reminder that, even now, every word, every gesture would be captured, analyzed, replayed. Gone were the cheering crowds, the bright banners, the hopeful energy that had once defined her campaign events. Today there was only somber silence and the weight of what had been lost. Her voice, once so sure, so vibrant, now carried a softness tinged with resignation. After much reflection, she began, I have decided that I will not seek re-election at the end of my current term. I believe it is in the best interest of my constituents and of our nation that I step aside so that fresh voices may rise to meet the challenges ahead. The statement was met not with gasps, not with shouts, but with the low murmur of pens scratching across notepads, of cameras adjusting focus. Commentators watching live feeds began to speak in hushed tones. The swiftest fall from grace in recent political memory, one said, a cautionary tale of ambition, missteps, and the unforgiving court of public opinion. Outside the building, where supporters had once gathered to celebrate victories, no crowds remained. Only a scattering of curious onlookers watched as the press conference ended, as Jasmine stepped down from the podium, her shoulders squared but her eyes heavy. In her campaign office, the signs of retreat were everywhere. Chairs were stacked against the walls, campaign posters curled at the corners, discarded in piles near the door. A lone volunteer packed away boxes of leftover flyers, the slogans on them now hollow echoes of promises that would never be fulfilled. The energy that had once pulsed through the space was gone, replaced by the quiet finality of an ending, written not in speeches, but in silence. Far from the cameras, J.D. Vance walked alone at dusk. The marble steps of Capitol Hill cool beneath his boots, the air filled with the soft hum of the city settling into night. The headlines of the day were filled with Jasmine's announcement, with the commentary and analysis that would surely dominate the news cycle for days. But J.D. had no desire to read them. This was not a night for celebration. His thoughts were his own as he moved through the fading light, the monuments around him standing tall against the darkening sky. True leadership isn't loud, he reflected, the words as steady in his mind as they had been on his lips during the debate. It's loyal. He thought of the faces he'd seen on factory floors, in town halls, along main streets that had once thrived and could thrive again. Faces lined with worry, but also with hope. Fragile, but real. He paused at the edge of a terrace overlooking the city, the lights below twinkling like distant stars. The weight of public trust settled on his shoulders, heavier now than during the debate, heavier than any headline could capture. It was not the trust given in a single night, but the kind earned slowly, through action, through listening, through the choices made long after the cameras turned away. There were no fireworks, no cheering crowds, no speeches prepared. J.D. felt no need for them. There was only the quiet promise he made to himself, to stay steady, to remember why he stood, and for whom. The city stretched before him, its challenges vast, its possibilities greater still. And with a final glance at the horizon, J.D. turned, ready for the work that still lay ahead. In a classroom miles away, the sun streamed through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the golden light as a civics teacher prepared to inspire the next generation. On the screen at the front of the room, a clip played. Not of the chaos of the debate, not of the collapse of a career, but of the moment that had come to symbolize something more. J.D. Vance, standing calm and firm, stating clearly, it's about loyalty. Loyalty to the workers who built this country. The room was quiet as the clip ended. The students, normally restless at this hour, sat still, thoughtful. A boy near the front, no older than 12, raised his hand. Is that what loyalty looks like? he asked, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and something deeper. The yearning to understand what it meant to stand for something in a world that so often seemed to reward noise over substance. The teacher nodded, her smile gentle but proud. That's what standing for something means. That's what it means to use your voice not for yourself, but for those who count on you. That's what leadership can be. The boy looked back at the screen, where the image of J.D. Vance lingered for a moment longer before fading to black. His eyes shone not with admiration alone, but with inspiration, the spark that comes when a young mind sees the shape of what might be possible. Around him, his classmates whispered quietly, the lesson sinking in not as a lecture, but as a story they could feel, a standard they could one day choose to meet. Outside, the world moved on. Headlines shifted to new crises, new debates, new dramas. But in that room, in that moment, the legacy of what had happened, of what J.D. had stood for, of what Jasmine's fall had taught, lived on. It lived in the questions those students would ask, in the choices they would make, in the way they would see loyalty, integrity, and truth not as distant ideals, but as real, reachable virtues. And as the bell rang and the students filed out, the boy glanced back once more at the now dark screen. He walked a little taller that day, the weight of the lesson settling on him not as a burden, but as a quiet call to be better, to stand for something, and to remember that true leadership doesn't seek the spotlight, it earns it. This story reminds us that true leadership is not measured by loud words or fleeting applause, but by loyalty, resilience, and quiet action that uplifts others. J.D.'s journey shows how integrity and purpose can bridge divides, inspire renewal, and restore faith in what many thought was lost. Jasmine's fall, though painful, serves as a cautionary tale about the cost of forgetting those we serve. In the end, the story isn't just about politics. It's about all of us and the choices we make when no one is watching. What does loyalty mean to you? And in your own life, how do you stand for something bigger than yourself? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.